Kate Winkler Dawson.
And I'm Paul Holes.
This is Buried Bones. Hey, Paul.
Hey, Kate, how are you?
I'm fine. Happy post-holidays.
I know. It's time just is flying. The older I get, it seems like these holidays come faster and faster.
You had a milestone on this holiday, right?
Kind of. This is the first year for me in 33 years that I haven't had children in the house.
Oh my gosh. They came home for Thanksgiving and for the holidays, right? For Christmas?
You're right. So I have two kids that are in college, two different colleges in the Midwest, and they both came home at the same time. So we were empty nesters leading up to the holiday season. But now, they're going back to college and won't see them again. Well, chances are won't see them again until their spring break.
Oh my gosh. So I'm asking for a friend here. Do they have certain expectations when they come home from college? I've got two kids getting ready to go in a couple of years. Like, what do they think? Do they think things are frozen in time? Is that what happens?
Yeah, we just treat, when they come back, they get back into their routine, and they get, they have to do their own laundry, but they just do their normal routine. Sometimes they have some assignments, and my daughter is a trumpet player, so she has to continue to practice even though she's home. But we just want them to be comfortable. And, I considered moving this where I'm podcasting from up into their space where they have their computers. Mm-hmm. But then I thought about it, and then that would be such a disruption for them when they do get the chance to come home. So I think I'm going to be in this space for our podcast into the foreseeable future.
Well, this is a good space, so I approve of it. I think that's fine. I remember wanting to come home and just the shrine that it was my room stays exactly the same. And, and I think my mom and my dad both kept it that way. But I wanted everything to be the same. I miss the dog. I miss my car. I miss, because I was going to school in Boston. I just wanted everything sort of frozen. And I was unaccepting that things change when you're gone. So I wonder if your kids feel like that too.
I think so. Like for me, I was a military brat, so I was used to moving around. In fact, I needed to have different spaces. If I was in one location that didn't change for a period of time, I'd start going nuts. So I would drive my first wife nuts because I would constantly rearrange the house.
Did you break that somehow? Therapy? What had changed?
Not so much from therapy. It was just as I got older, that urge started to fade because now I'm living in one location for my career. Well, not one location, but generally I was staying in places longer. And then that just that urge to be in a new place started to go away. Yeah.
Well, when one of my girls goes to camp, she laments missing these dogs, both of our dogs. And it's not usually us, it's mostly the dogs. And I was like that too. My mom said, you always said I miss the dog so much. So I understand that because the dog didn't ask me to do stuff like my laundry, things like that.
Sure.
Well, I'm glad you guys had good holidays, and the empty nester thing I know takes a little bit of time to get used to. It's nice when they came home and it sounds like everything went really well.
It did. Thanks for asking.
Yeah. Well, we're going to get to a story located in a place that feels like home for me, my second home, which is England. And this is a really interesting story. Now, I've never been to Liverpool, and I'm not even going to ask. I'm pretty sure you've never been to Liverpool already.
I have not. Now, but that's located northwest of London, right?
Oh, gosh. Don't ask me that, Paul. Okay, we're going to say yes. I think so.
Yeah, I think I met some people from Liverpool. They have very different accents than the people in London, right?
Equally as lovely. Yes, equally as lovely. And I am not a soccer/football fan, but I know what a big deal that is. It has nothing to do with our story. But we've never done something in Liverpool, so this will be interesting.
All right, looking forward to it.
Okay, let's set the scene. Okay, we are in Liverpool, like I mentioned, and it is January 20th, 1931, which means we are smack in the middle of the almost 12 years between World War I ending and then World War II beginning.
Okay.
So We are at a street called 29 Wolverton Street. It's a very nice home. So we are focusing on William and Julia Wallace, and I'll tell you more about them in a little bit. I wanted to show you an interesting photo. So I sent you your photos. I bet you haven't downloaded them yet, but maybe you have.
I have not, but
you have not.
Okay, so I've got it up, and I'm assuming William and Julia side by side in this first frame.
Correct. So I wanted you to see the photo just because we've talked about sort of people who don't look their age, people who do look their age in the past. Sometimes we're both surprised about how people look so much older. And, I think that has to do with obviously genetics, right? But also just the wear and tear of certain eras are on people. Would you think?
No, for sure. Oh, yeah, absolutely. And you just think about, were they wearing sunscreen back in the day? That's a huge one.
I wanted you to see the photo of William and Julia because I think it illustrates sort of their level, their social stature in life. So William at the time when all of this starts to happen is 52 and Julia is 69. Now, I don't think that is the case in these photos necessarily. Maybe William is 52, but Julia, I don't think in this photo is 69. There's quite a big age difference here.
No, for sure. At least in the photo, William looks to me to be approaching mid 70s. I'm shocked that he's 52 in that photo. Now, the photo of Julia, she looks younger there than 69 for sure.
But, seemingly well-to-do, I think,
yes.
Couple so far. Okay. So William comes home. He's a collections agent for Prudential Assurance. And so he makes pretty good money. He's just returned home from a day of rounds. He's having a hard time getting in. And this is 8:40 at night. The front door seems to be locked. And Julia, who is inside, is not responding to his knock.
Okay.
So he sees that the back gate is closed, but it's unbolted, which is unusual. And he tries the back door. He can't get in there either. It's also locked. So there are two neighbors, John and Florence Johnston. They hear him knocking, and I think his knocking is getting a little more frantic, probably because he's annoyed. He can't get inside. And they come and help. So they try the front door and the back door again. They finally get through the back door. And this is when they make the discovery. A lot of times I try to lead this up to a big mystery of who the victim might be. The victim in this case is Julia. I mentioned she's 69. And the Johnsons see fairly quickly, I would say, that Julia is lying on the floor and she's dead. And she is face down on her right side. And there is a 9-inch diameter pool of her own blood, we will assume, underneath her, under her face. There's also brain matter and there's bone. On the left-hand side of her face above, and in the front of her ear is a 2-inch wound that penetrates 3 inches deep. You can tell that we're going to have a medical examiner coming up here pretty soon because we have some pretty precise things. Florence is very upset, as is understandable, and she rushes to Julia. Her body is still warm, Florence says. And as an investigator on the scene, what would this immediately tell you? This is so far fairly straightforward. They get in, they see her dead on the floor. She's got gashes on her face and there's blood.
Well, it sounds like she's received a devastating blow to the left side of her head that's penetrated into her skull. This is why you have the blood, brain, and bone matter that is surrounding her body there. One of the observations that I would be making would be the blood flows out of that wound. Do they change direction, indicating that after she starts bleeding, did she reposition? Like she starts bleeding while she's upright and then she goes and is laying face down. I'd also be paying attention to the blood pool. They're saying that her body is still warm. That tends to suggest that this is a relatively recent death. But the blood also is indicative of time, because as the blood pools outside the body, eventually it starts to separate. It starts to coagulate. And so if she's been laying there for a period of time, then I might expect to see the separation within the blood pool to indicate, there's a little bit more time that's passed than just what the temperature of the body is indicating. But the environment is also something that is significant. It's, 1:40 or 8:40 at night in January in Liverpool. I imagine it's pretty cold outside. Is it warm inside the house, or is it pretty cool inside the house? That would have an impact on the assessment of how long prior to the discovery of the body she was killed.
I wanted to do a little bit of quick research for you to kind of get an indication of those two things. So the average temperature in January in Liverpool, I would say it looks like it's between 36 and 39 degrees Fahrenheit.
Okay.
And I also wanted to double check. It would indeed be very dark at 8:40 p.m. in January in Liverpool.
Yeah.
So those are two things. Usually you want to know more about the autopsy, and we're going to have a medical examiner show up here pretty soon. I have photos also of the front and back door. I do not have photos of Julia's body laying there, but I have a pretty big description from the medical examiner. So
Great.
You want me to continue on with what the neighbors initially see until the police come in, or where do you want to head, do you think?
Yeah, let's get the initial observations, and then, flow into the autopsy.
Okay. I'm going to tell you about Julia and William in just a little bit about their interests, which will probably explain some of the things in their room. So this is, I wanted to make sure that I said it. This is their parlor. So it could be the equivalent of their living room. There is a piano that Julia plays. It's undisturbed. It doesn't seem like there's anything that's been displaced. The blinds are drawn and the mantelpiece gaslight is lit. So we have a lot of gas lights happening around the house. There's Julia still has her wedding ring on and a large brooch. And there is a rain jacket, they'll call a Macintosh, that is William's, and it's crumpled underneath Julia's body. It's blood drenched, according to everybody there, including the medical examiner who will come in a little bit. It's also burned. And there's a fireplace that's going, and there are charred fragments of it near the fireplace, but it's crumpled under her body. And there, you could talk about that, but I could also talk more specifically about the blood.
Okay, I didn't quite catch. You said you called it a Macintosh? Is this a jacket?
Yeah, it's a jacket.
Okay, and this is William's jacket underneath her body, but it appears that part of the jacket got close enough to the fire to where it either caught fire itself or was charred because of the heat. Mm-hmm. Now, the fire is significant because even though it's cold outside, it's going to be warmer where her body is located at. Mm-hmm. So that could potentially speed up aspects of time change with her death and what we would be looking for. The jacket being blood drenched, is it underneath her head, or does she have other bleeding injuries, or was the blood on this jacket prior to her falling down on it or coming to rest on it? I would start looking at, did somebody use this jacket to try to stem the flow of blood from her head, and then gave up and just left it in place?
Okay. Well, I'll give you some more information, especially when the ME shows up, and then maybe that'll explain some things. This is what the initial observations from the neighbors and from William say. They say there is blood splattered at an average, they said about 4 feet, and in some places 7 feet up the wall. And when the ME says, like I said, I'll tell you in a little bit more. One other little note, Julia plays the piano, William plays the violin. His case is on an easy chair to the left of the fireplace, and there's kind of just blood everywhere, but nothing is displaced, which I think they think is going to be key coming up here too.
Well, the blood spatter is significant. So if she just received a single blow, devastating blow that crushed in her skull, there wouldn't be this blood spatter. So what that tells me is that she received multiple blows, and some of those blows were to what we call a pooled blood source, probably her head. And then when whatever the weapon is impacting that pooled blood source, that's when you get the spatter. Now, when you say it's ranging from like 4 feet up to 7 feet up, now I would be assessing those patterns. Is she receiving some blows while she's upright, or does a spatter indicate that the blows were occurring while she's actually down on the floor? Mm-hmm. But I imagine some of what this spatter is potentially cast off. So if you have a weapon that is now getting bloodied and on the upswing, some of that blood gets flung off, and it can go a significant distance vertically, even up on the ceiling or behind the offender. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of how I'm envisioning what you just told me about the observations of the blood patterns in that room. It sounds like she's receiving multiple blows, unless it's, it's a gunshot, and now the spatter would look completely different.
And the Johnsons don't know yet. They certainly call the police quickly. Okay, now we're at a fork in the road regarding information. We can talk about the Wallaces, their relationship, what they were like, or we can get the police there sooner and the medical examiner and get to the autopsy. So do you want to do victimology first, or do you want to get to the medical stuff?
No, I think at this point I want the medical stuff so I can kind of assess, what the offender did to the victim, and then start hearing about the victimology and go from there.
Okay. Now you've got here's another fork. When the police come, they start talking about what's been stolen. Some weird things are going on in the house. Or do we go straight to the ME and he shows up and says, these are the wounds? We're still going right to ME?
Yes, please.
Okay. Yeah, he's like, shut up. Let's get into this. Okay. There's a cop. We don't care about him right now, but he'll be important. His name's Fred Williams, and he's a constable. So this is not a police detective right now. Sure. He's the initial person who shows up, and then they call the medical examiner, and the medical examiner is a professor named John Edward McFall, and he gets there at 9:50, which is about an hour after, she's discovered by William and by the Johnstons. He's also the one who's going to oversee the postmortem examination and also all the blood patterns that are on the walls and the floor and everywhere else. Okay. This is what McFall's initial impression is. He said that, of course, there's no indication of a struggle. And there's an author named Joe Nickel who does a really great job summarizing, all of this, including McFall's initial description of the forensics. So this is from Joe's article, but also, this is stuff from McFall directly. The forensic says almost all the spatter was concentrated in the corner of the room where William's violin case sits on the armchair, with very scant amounts anywhere else in the entire house except small amounts of spray on some papers on a chair. And there's a key thing on the toilet rim upstairs, in the water closet upstairs. And there is blood on a pound treasury note in the middle bedroom, so not in the parlor. The rest is entirely concentrated into the corner of the room with the violin case. And this is one more interesting thing that McFall says. He says that the blood spatter in the parlor creates a soda water bottle effect. So he said round spots and partly diagonal spots concentrated in front of the parlor chair. He wonders if it's just before she was attacked he wonders that if she was sitting there right before she was attacked and her head was turned to the right as if she was talking to somebody. So these are the initial observations he made. And then he has some initial observations of her body while she's lying there.
Well, the description of the blood spatter, where you have a concentration of circular droplets as well as some diagonal droplets, where those circular droplets are located will be a result of the blood droplets striking the wall straight on. So that's an indication of the height of I'm assuming the only bleeding injury is her head. The height her head was at the time it received a blow to a pooled blood source. When you have droplets now that are spraying out, they start striking that wall surface at angles. And so they form these diagonal stains. Mm-hmm. So we can use that as part of a blood pattern interpretation to in essence, determine roughly in space where her head was at the time she received that blow. Mm-hmm. The critical information for me is, okay, what height is McFall seeing this? Is this down near the floor, or is this up higher as if she received a blow while she was sitting in the chair?
Now, do you want to answer, what can you say, give us both scenarios, whatever it might be?
Well, at least, his conclusion about her head being turned a certain direction, mm-hmm. As if she were talking to somebody. The problem with, human bodies is it's very dynamic. Mm-hmm. So she may have been sitting in the chair and recognized a offender coming up on her. And now mm-hmm. she's moving as the offender is attacking. And so that's going to that dynamic aspect of the offender-victim interaction always impacts our ability to truly reconstruct what's going on. So I would have to hear more about his observations and the actual medical findings to see if I agree with that. Okay. But it really does sound, with all the blood, and you have the blood spatter concentrated in the corner near this chair, then that appears to where at least, the fatal aspect of the attack occurred. The other items that you talked about having some blood on them are transportable items. Mm-hmm. And so the question is, are these items that could have been placed there by the offender after Julia was killed, or is there any indication that Julia had an earlier bleeding injury somewhere else in the house and then ultimately ended up where she was killed?
Mm-hmm. And what you're talking about there is, the violin case, which we talked about. There are papers, and there's that 1 pound treasury note that, is found in the middle bedroom. Right. And then we have one other blood that I think is a little confusing, but you can. And
that's in the bathroom, right? Wasn't that?
Yeah, and I have photos of that too.
Oh, okay, good. Because, that could be the offender cleaning up after he's killed Julia.
Okay. Let me get to what they say with the at least the autopsy part of this. So he says that there are 10 diagonal, apparently incised wounds on the left side of the back of her head. The left frontal bone has pierced the front of her brain. The whole of the left side of the back of the skull was driven in and broken into pieces. These wounds were the result of being struck 3 or 4 times with terrific force by a hard, large-headed instrument. First of all, can you tell that from those wounds?
Oftentimes, yes. So this is when you start assessing the damage to the skull. Let's say somebody is being hit in the head with just a typical hammer, 1 inch round diameter. You can literally see the skull get circular punched out of it. Or if the hammer hits it off, kind of on the edge, now you get like a half moon effect. When you start dealing with something more massive, let's say a sledgehammer, now you have that crushing type of injury. So a pathologist can assess, certain characteristics of the weapon, both its size as well as features of the weapon sometimes.
Okay. Well, let's continue on. He talks about time of death. And he said that her hands are cold, but her body is still warm. And he says, based on the presence of rigor mortis in her neck and her upper part of the left arm, as well as the congealment of the blood that had pooled around her head, he thinks the time of death was about 6:50. So this would have been 2 hours before William tried to get into the house. I don't know if we've had details about rigor mortis that detailed, like this is where she's stiff and this is why I think it. What do you think about his assessment?
Well, it's a rough assessment, but she's been dead long enough to where now you're starting to see the rigor form. She's been dead long enough to where that blood, as I talked about before, is starting to congeal. That's what he is observing. the complexity is she's near the fire, so things are going to speed up. So, I would use that time of death as just a rough estimate. I could not, like, let's say if I find a suspect and he's got an alibi up until he doesn't at 6:50, I would be, I can't use that alibi to eliminate him. She could have been killed, at 5:00, and you'd still see these same types of characteristics.
Okay, I'm going to jump down big time, something I didn't anticipate doing, because we have a forensics person who comes in the day after this happens, and he is the city analyst. His name is William Henry Roberts, and I feel like I should go ahead and bring this in now, so maybe we can close out, the forensics and the blood and the autopsy stuff before we move into more stuff that's going to be speculative. So William Henry Roberts comes in and he looks at 15 articles from the crime scene. The raincoat, Macintosh, on which Julia's body has been found is extensively and heavily stained with human blood on the right side, both inside and outside, and on the upper inner side of the right sleeve. The outside of the left cuff and a large area near the left pocket were similarly stained. The bottom right side of the coat is also burned off. Blood is found splashed and smeared on 2 photographs. So now we're finally done with the jacket. So blood is splashed and smeared on 2 photographs and the wide end of the violin case. The cover of sheet music, a cushion, the corner of a hearth rug, and the front of Julia's skirt are all splattered in blood. In the primary bedroom, blood is smeared on one of the 1-pound notes in the glass jar, in a glass jar. It appears that a blood-stained thumb has been run across this note. There is no blood, though, on a cash box that appears to have been looted. And I have to go back up for that. And any of William's clothing, even though they used a sensitive benzodine test, because William is going to be on the list of suspects, obviously. Or there's a sledgehammer that they found in William's chemistry lab. He's a chemist at a local university. So they've tested what they think are the murder weapons. They've tested a suspect's clothing, and that's where the rest of the blood is found once you get a forensics guy in there.
Yeah, the amount of blood on the jacket, what I would be looking at is that how this blood staining is occurring on the jacket. Is that entirely consistent with her just laying on top of the jacket after she's been killed? Or is there blood staining that indicates that potentially her body has been moved, or there was other interactions between the offender and the victim that caused additional staining on this jacket? Why is the jacket even there in the first place? And then, of course, why is it charred? Now, some of these other items that have blood on it, again, it comes down to, well, how are they positioned in the crime scene with where the blood spatter is, where the victim ultimately is found? Is there any indication that, the victim, let's say she's upright and she's receiving blows as she's trying to fight off the offender, and now you have some blood staining occurring on some of these other objects. So all of that, the analyst, what was his name? William Henry Roberts?
Yes, William Henry. Yep.
So this analyst, his observations of the blood patterns, it's not giving me enough information of the evidence in situ at the crime scene for me to kind of get a better feel of what's going on with Julia. The fact that her ring is still on, she's got a brooch on. There's light ransacking. Does this sound like it's a financially motivated crime? Right now, it really doesn't. And the prior McFall observations of what he called 10 incisive, wounds to the, left backside of her head. That's the wrong use of that term. That incisive wounds are created by a sharp-edged weapon. Now, if it's something like a hatchet or an axe, sure, but chances are those are what would technically today be called lacerations, where the skin has been split because a result of blows. And everything else about how he's describing her injuries indicate that I believe all her injuries to her head are a result of multiple blows.
Mm-hmm. You got it. Okay, let's get to one other piece of blood evidence, which is the toilet rim upstairs. So I have a wide shot, a close-up shot of this blood, which they say has been congealed. There is also a map of the whole house, which is sprawling, I would say. So, I guess once we start talking about the entry and who has access, you can look at the map, or you want to just get done with blood?
Yeah, let's just get done with the blood. So
Okay.
I've kind of scrolled. You held out on me, Kate. It looks like there's a picture of this room, right?
Well, this is a different room.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So this is we're going to talk about the cash box in a little bit, but this is a totally different. I mean, this is a big place. This is a totally different room.
Yeah. All right. So I'm looking at the toilet, and there is a bright red circular drop that is on the right front top surface of the rim of the toilet. The seat is up. The toilet itself, the water is you can see where there's like staining as a result of algae and stuff. And then there's a close-up shot, which is, again, just showing what appears to be a mostly circular drop of blood. And what this tells me is that this is just a single drop of blood that struck the toilet straight on. There's an object that has blood on it, could be a person, and a single drop of blood just dropped down onto that toilet. And not from a great height, because I'm not seeing scalloping around the edge of this. It looks like almost a perfect circular drop. So that's all it is. It's just one droplet of dripped blood. Mm-hmm. And I don't see where they're saying there's just no way that you would use the term congealed with a droplet like this. Basically, this blood would dry very quickly. Okay.
So later on, when we do end up having a trial, the doctor will get on the stand, the professor will get on the stand, and he'll say that aside from the fact that he's not sure if his assessment of the rigor mortis was 100% accurate on the time frame, he said that he and the detectives walked freely from the parlor to other rooms of the house. So I think the insinuation here is that it's possible that they transported some of this blood to different areas. And they can't be specific about that. But, he talks a little bit about the toilet rim, and he gives some details about how much blood that is. I remember reading somewhere, maybe it's menstrual blood. Julia was 69. I don't think so. But, who knows? There's just sort of looking at all of these different options. But you're right. I mean, you're saying that this is not a sign of a big cleanup or something in this bathroom necessarily. No.
This is, in fact, you really can't even draw any type of conclusion outside it's a single droplet of dripped blood. And is this, whose is it? Today we would be able to determine that. Is it coming from Julia, or is it coming from somebody else? Something that you just brought up is a significant thing. There's a reason why we freeze crime scenes and prevent people from wandering around. It's because there can be contamination that can throw off an interpretation of what happened. Given what you just told me, is it possible that, one of the responders dealing with the crime scene had to go use the bathroom and is now leaving that little bit of dripped blood off of, I doubt if they were using gloves, off of the hand or whatever. So, but it's also possible that you have the offender, going into this bathroom to clean up, and whether it comes off of his hand or a weapon, you have a drop of blood from Julia that gets transferred into the bathroom.
Okay. Let's talk about the strange circumstances that the police constable notes when he gets there, which is around 9:10. So he got there 25 minutes, it sounds like, after, this initial discovery. So here are the things where we start putting together a motive, I think. And then I'll tell you about Julia and William in a little bit. So, as I said before, no signs of forced entry, no other indicators of burglary, but some kind of weird stuff. A cabinet door in the living room. So that's what you erroneously thought I was holding back from you. Totally different room, Paul.
Okay.
There's a cabinet door in the living room that's broken, and a half crown and 2 shilling pieces are on the floor. Okay, which is not very much money.
Okay.
William keeps his insurance collection box. So, I told you before that was his job, is he would go and collect insurance money. He keeps his insurance collection box stowed on the top shelf of a 7-foot tall bookcase. He says that it's been looted for £4, which is almost $500 today. But there are no bloodied marks on it. And Constable Williams is thinking to himself, why would a robber kill a woman, try to loot the house, and then put the cash box back on the top shelf? And so if you look at that photo that you had pointed out earlier, you'll see it doesn't sound, they're saying that this is not in disarray. This looks like a pretty messy room. But, this is the state of the room where the cash box was kept.
Sure. And, the idea that this cash box, which is very nondescript, that the offender recognized it was something that would have some money in it. And so takes it down, takes a little bit of money out, and then puts it back. Yeah. And then you have a cabinet door that, has been broken and a few coins scattered on the floor. This is, like in my experience processing burglary scenes, this seems inconsistent with an offender who is now desperately trying to find, valuables. It almost sounds more like the offender knows exactly where the money's at, and the fact that you don't have a lot taken suggests to me that possibly this is a staged crime scene where now somebody like William is trying to make it look like an intruder came in and it was a financially motivated crime, but he doesn't want to lose all that money. So I'm starting to get suspicious of William.
Okay. Well, let's continue on. Keep your suspicions to yourself, Paul Holes. Not really. You can say it if you want. Okay. They go upstairs and the gas lights are on, which would be normal. They find Julia's purse. The purse has not been taken or looted. There are pound notes that are stuffed in a glass jar in the bedroom. They're still there. I mentioned there's like a little bit of blood, I think on the outside of the jar of that, but that's about it. So this is what I think was interesting, a good observation from the police constable. He said there is a clean but recently used nail brush in the bathroom. So it's one of those, brushes with the bristles where you would clean your nails off.
Yep.
And, it's wet. He said that in this front spare bedroom, the bed sheets are totally disordered. There are pillows and clothes that are strewn all over the floor, but nobody opened any drawers. And Julia's jewelry is tucked away in a cabinet. So this is even more suspicious. And you can look at the layout if you want to at some point.
This is not a ransacked crime scene at all. And with such focus, the damage to the cabinet door, the cash box being put back, and nothing else is being taken, or other drawers being opened, entirely inconsistent with an offender who's going to go throughout a house. And, experienced burglars can size up really quickly. Okay, where most likely am I going to find things that are worth taking, and oftentimes they'll go into the master bedroom. They go into the master bathroom today, the master closet. This is where you'll find the jewelry. So this is not a financially motivated crime, even though it appears that there was an attempt to make it look that way. And the homicide occurred in that, where Julia's body was found. And it's just, did violence start somewhere else? And then during her attempt, did she run to that room? That front room is looks like it's right next to the front door of the house. Though you have to walk it down. You have to go through the vestibule, walk down a hallway, and then go to the right to get into that front room. Mm-hmm. I would consider the possibility that somebody knocked on the front door and, Julia opened it. Mm-hmm. And now he rushes in and kills Julia. But then why? This is where I think, learning the victimology becomes important, because this appears that the offender's intent was to kill Julia, and wasn't coming in to burglarize, to basically take items of value. It's not a financially motivated crime, in my opinion.
Okay. Let's keep moving through this. Okay, now I think we might be through all of the forensics and the things that are missing and not missing. And let's go ahead and get to the couple, since you're suspicious of William already. We'll see if you are rightly so. It seems like they're a happy couple, of course. We hear that all the time. They were happy and they kept to themselves. They were married 16 years. William, I showed you the photo. He's lanky, he's eccentric, he's worldly, in a lot of different disciplines. In 1907, he developed a severe kidney issue, which will become important later on, which impeded his ability to move around quickly and compelled him to come back to London after they had been doing a lot of traveling. Then he became a lecturer in chemistry at the Liverpool Technical Institute. And then he, was doing what he currently does also, which is being a collector for an insurance company. Julia was an accomplished pianist. She sounds so interesting. She was a painter, needlepoint craftswoman. She was just sort of like an interesting, well-rounded person overall. Mm-hmm. And, once we get into the circumstances of the police are starting to suspect William and what he says happens, hopefully it doesn't get too confusing for you, but let me we'll go through it and you tell me what you think. So that night, William goes down to the station with the constable, and at the station, he describes some of the things that have been happening, he says, over the past 2 days. So you tell me what makes sense here. This is sort of convoluted. The day before the murder, which is January 19th, he was in a chess tournament because he's into chess and violining or playing the violin. So, because he's into chess and he plays the violin and he has all these different interests. When he gets to the chess tournament, which is about 7:45 or so, there's a guy there named Captain Samuel Betty. And he says somebody gave you a message. Somebody named R.M. Quoltrew had called for William at this cafe where this tournament was being held about 7:15, 30 minutes earlier. According to the guy, the captain who gave him this note, this guy, R.M. Quoltrew, wanted to schedule a meeting regarding a new insurance policy for his daughter. And this would not have been unusual at the time. He requested William meet him at a particular spot the next day at 7:30 p.m. So this would have been when Julia was murdered, about an hour and 20 minutes before she was discovered by William and the neighbors. Okay, so he says, meet me at this place. This is what the note says. So the day that the murder happens, William collected his insurance payments. He has dinner with Julia about 6:00, and then he heads out to go meet this guy. And according to him, he left the house about 6:45, and he was wearing a beige raincoat and walked. Now, I don't know if this is the same raincoat. Must not have been. He was wearing a raincoat and walked a third of a mile to a church. He promptly gets lost. But there are tram operators at 2 different locations that help him. So he's actually out there, trying to catch these different trams to get to this location. He gets lost. He asks a lot of people for directions, and he's looking, street signs. He's at local post offices. He's kind of all over the place. And he wonders if this guy had written down the wrong address for the appointment. He gives up at about 8:10. He gets on a tram and he heads home. So police take down the statement and they examine his clothing and his boots and his hands for blood. They can't find anything. He is still their prime suspect. And over the next 9 days, he gives them 3 more statements. So what do you think about this alibi? A mystery man says, meet me at this mystery place far away on the night that his wife is murdered.
So just a little bit of a statement analysis. He has dinner with the victim at 6 o'clock, claims that he leaves at 6:45 in the evening. And now he's going out to try to find this man and is lost and is now interacting with a bunch of people. Sounds like he's trying to set up witnesses to support this alibi. And you have to dig into this from an investigative standpoint. Can you track down who this R.M. Couture is and verify that there was actually an arrangement? Also, this note, it's the Captain Betty, who's the one that is passing this message on from Couture to William. You got to get his statements. And then the next 3 statements, how consistent are they relative to this initial statement? William is now giving 3 more statements. How are those details changing? And are those details changing as William is assessing, what the circumstances of the case are, and he's trying to, come up with something to cover himself. Yeah, and right now I can't say, William's responsible or not, but this initial statement is sounding suspicious to me, where he's just trying to set up an alibi. And I think Julia is killed between 6 and 6:45 roughly, because the time of death estimates by the pathologists and stuff, again, as I mentioned before, are really rough estimates.
Yeah, absolutely. And the medical examiner will clarify that later on and say, this is my best guess, but he does revise it back to 6 o'clock, essentially. So the day after the murder, 2 witnesses come forward. One is a woman named Sarah Jane Draper. She is the housekeeper. And there's a kid named Alan Close. He's 14 and he's the milk boy. So this is what the housekeeper says, because they're wondering about the weapon. She says that a foot-long piece of iron that generally leaned against the fireplace in the parlor where Julia was killed is gone. And there is also a 9-inch poker that is missing from the kitchen fireplace. And she also says that the front bedroom where I described all of the bedding was out of place, that this would have never happened under Julia's watch. Everything was neat and proper. So, again, we're in a time period where there's fireplaces in every room and there are weapons in every room. And there's axes. Sure. And in this case, we've got pokers. So, and we've had just decades worth of cases where you have things that people presume are the weapons and they've gone missing and they go, wait, where is that wrench, fireplace poker, butcher knife?
Yeah. Well, and those 2 potential weapons, the fireplace poker, which is only 9 inches long. And then you have this length of iron, and there doesn't appear that there's more description to what it is. But the 10 linear wounds that the pathologist notes on Julia, entirely consistent with being hit multiple times with a relatively narrow and potentially lightweight weapon like the poker. And then you potentially have, with this piece of iron, which sounds like it's a more massive and longer weapon, that could have been used to finish her off. And that would be very much in line with the damage done to her skull, where now you have the brain and skull fragments, being scattered around her head, or at least where the blows were occurring. And, 2 inches wide, 3 inches deep, it could also be the end of something like that piece of iron just being thrust into her head.
Well, we'll come back to the weapons in a little bit. They are anxious to try to find these weapons. The milk boy. I don't doubt that Alan knows the circumstances in the right order. I wonder about the time. He says he saw Julia the day of the murder at 6:45 p.m. He says he dropped off milk at the house, and then he stopped by the Johnson's house next door at 31 Wolverton Street to give them milk. He comes back and he collects the empty jugs from Julia. And she told him that she had been ill with bronchitis. So that's the thing that the milk boy contributes. So, if we believe his time, then she's alive, at 6:45 to 7 o'clock. I don't know how long that route was, but we might find out more when we get into trial.
And I guess I just, need to know how Alan knows what time he's at Julia's house. Does he have a watch on? Is he just estimating because, he knows his route and how, what time he left to start delivering milk, and he would have been at Julia's house at 6:45. So it's really kind of drilling down on the veracity of Alan's recollection of that time that he saw Julia alive.
What I have, the information I have is that there will be a defense and they will question poor 14-year-old kid on the stand that he says he might have seen Julia alive between 6:30 and 6:45. So either he had a watch and he just wasn't sure of the time, or you're right, he was estimating. He's done this route a gazillion times and he knows what time he was supposed to be done. Yeah. So, this plays kind of into William's alibi because the police start running some practice runs on could he have done all of this, because there were witnesses who saw him on trams. So the timing is important. And eventually Alan will say, well, I know it was before 6:45, or I know it was between 6:30 and 6:45, but still, you've got people who say Alan said definitely 6:45. So he must have been wearing a watch, but you've got the defense eventually will shake him a little bit. Sure.
And if are there witnesses of Alan that can corroborate, his movements during that time frame?
Well, presumably the Johnstons, because he dropped off milk. However, I don't see whether or not they answered the door. So he might have left the milk on the stoop, but they were home at 8:50 when William comes knocking.
Okay. Yeah. And so let's say we know that Julia is found dead at 8:50. Mm-hmm. So now we have a window of 6:45 to 8:50. Mm-hmm. The homicide itself will not take long. That's a matter of a few minutes. So now it is reconstructing William's movements per these other witnesses and seeing, well, how could he have done all these movements after killing Julia around 6:45?
Well, before the police get to that, they have a complication, which is William's second statement, where he has an idea about who actually did this. There are two people that he knows that he feels like, had the potential here, and they get drawn into this too. So on his second statement, he says that there is a 22-year-old named Richard Gordon. So we go by Gordon Perry. And then another one who is a 30-year-old named Joseph Caleb Marsden. So we kind of go by Perry and Marsden here. Both men are former colleagues of Williams at the insurance company. So in 1928, so this is about 3 years ago, Williams says he discovered that Gordon Perry, had been skimming money from clients. He also knows that Joseph Marsden was let go for financial irregularities, so probably petty thieving. And he says that they are viable suspects because, number one, they're bad people. Sounds like, there's people who would take money, but also because they knew William's schedule, because they knew the collecting schedule, kind of like with the milk boy. They know the collecting schedule of his company. So they know the layout of the house because they had been to the house before. They also knew where he had stored those payments on that really tall shelf in the cash box. So he said, I think that they went there to score money and, ran into Julia, ended up having to kill her. And then I have an explanation for who Qualtrough is also.
Well, maybe I'm demonstrating a bias against William right now, but these are just two individuals that he's pulling out of his past that have some criminal element to him, and understands, the job. But what happened inside this crime scene doesn't add up with these two guys coming in looking to financially profit from it. There's just too much focus on the homicide of Julia for me to buy that these two guys are there initially for financial purposes and then just abandon it because Julia ends up confronting them. I don't know. I'm skeptical of that.
Okay. Let me explain Qualtrough. And this is a real person. His name was Richard James Qualtrough. He has an alibi. He's not involved with this. The implication is that these two guys, Perry and Marsden, had used this client's name as a ruse, to draw away William so that they could go and rob him and then presumably kill his wife. But William knew this guy too. So it's not like, a random name that William wouldn't have known. So he was, if William's guilty like you believe, then he is trying to set potentially these two guys up also because he comes up with these names pretty quickly.
So this Qualtrough is R.W. Qualtrough, who's the one that supposedly gave the message through that captain in order to meet with William the next evening.
Right. So the same guy who didn't show up because this wasn't a real meeting and it was a ruse to draw William out. And, my point with this is that, yes, these two guys knew who that person was because he was a client at the insurance company, but so did William because William also worked there.
Sure. And so they're trying to draw William out to meet with this, set up this fake meeting. So now William's not at home and they're going to go in and take everything they possibly can, but they don't. Mm-hmm. And then they kill Julia in the process.
Yep. And, it's so interesting because we really could go on and on about Gordon and Marsden and what their motives could be. Neither of them, both of them are kind of into petty crimes. Nobody's really had anything serious. Marsden was home at the flu by himself, which is a great alibi or a terrible one. But, Gordon really was sort of, he wasn't really in the vicinity, but he didn't have a solid alibi either. Gordon said he was with his girlfriend and she backed him up. And that he visited somebody else and relatives and they backed him up. So over the last 100 years, less than 100 years, fewer than 100 years, you've had people who have said maybe these guys are the ones who did it, but the police really never thought so. They really felt like this was Marsden had no motivation and neither did Gordon. Exactly what you're saying, based on what they saw, taken or not taken. Especially, Paul, if they knew his route, wouldn't they know that he was going to be back home, at a certain time? And especially if they sent him someplace far flung, they would have to know it was going to take him this long to get home from a meeting once he realized this meeting wasn't going to happen. I would just think that they would have thought they'd have all the time in the world if they planned it to take whatever they wanted. And yet they didn't, right?
Well, and also if they're planning this far ahead and they knew William, they most certainly must have expected that Julia would be home.
Yeah.
So there's an inconsistency. That's where anytime you see an inconsistency, that is a red flag. You would think that to commit this crime, they would have chosen a time in which they knew that both William and Julia would be gone.
Yeah, you would think so. Yeah, I think most people now know, that whole thing around them is falling apart. Let me tell you about weapons one that was discovered around the time of the murder, and then one that was discovered just decades later. And this probably won't help William's case with you at all. But they find a small axe in a basket under the stairs. It was covered or hidden, I don't know what we want to even think about that, under old clothing but it is determined not to be the murder weapon. They must have tested for blood and, it came out negative. But on top of that, he does have an insurance policy on Julia, but it's maybe about $13,000. Not very much at all,
Sure. Well, it doesn't sound like the small axe is, probative at all.
Right.
And then, of course, he's profiting from his wife's death as a result of the insurance. Now it's, well, what's going on in William's life? Is he, so desperate for money that he's willing to kill his wife for what is a relatively small insurance policy? Or is there something else going on in William's life that is maybe better motivation for him to kill Julia?
Let me draw you back to one more weapon theory, and then we can talk a little bit more about that. So the author that I told you about, Joe Nickell, he found out that in about the mid-1930s, a few years after this happened, that new tenants moved in and they wanted to install electricity. So they removed the stove that was there in the kitchen. When they did, they found an iron bar wedged between the wall and the hearth. Now, we don't know anything about it, but Joe Nickell, and I think rightly so, believes this must have been the murder weapon, the missing iron bar, which I'm picturing as sort of like a crowbar, maybe. I don't know if there was a curved in or anything, but that's what I was sort of picturing, this foot long, that was missing from the fireplace, according to the housekeeper. So Joe Nickell says he shoved it behind the stove, and that's where it stayed.
Did they turn that into law enforcement? It seems strange to me that somebody remodeling is going, oh, we found this iron bar, and it becomes aware that potentially it's suspicious because a homicide had occurred in the house. Is that what's going on?
Well, this is probably about 4 or 5 years later after all of this happened. So this is quite a bit of time afterward, and the case comes to a conclusion. So no, I mean, that doesn't show up. That showed up specifically in Joe's research, not in our research. So I think this was, a story that just sort of, they said this seems likely because they just ultimately, it doesn't sound like they ever found the fireplace poker. And I sometimes I wonder when people use fireplace pokers, how effective that is, because you're not using them to poke. I mean, I guess you can have a good grip on them, but they're generally fairly thin. And I guess they could still do a lot of damage. I don't know. I don't know why I was just thinking about that.
No, they absolutely can do a lot of damage. Now, but this is also, assessing the injuries. And I've seen, bludgeonings with, similar type of weapons in which the offender fails to penetrate the skull or fracture the skull, and basically it's causing bleeding injuries because when this type of weapon strikes the scalp, the skin splits. It creates those lacerations, and there could be a lot of blood. And in something like the Golden State Killer case, in one of the homicides, actually in a couple of the homicides, he switches from a lightweight, narrow weapon to a much more massive weapon to finish the victims off. That's what I think is potentially going on here with Julia, where the maybe initial blows, those 10 incisive injuries that the pathologist noted on her head, is probably consistent with this fireplace poker. But then he goes to the more massive iron bar. Now, the one that is discovered behind the stove, is it the one that was used to kill Julia? At this point, it's just absolute speculation, unless it still exists and, blood is on it and we could do DNA testing to show it.
Well, let's get to the timeline because this is what leads to his arrest. The police retrace what he says his route was, and we do have people who witnessed him, on these different trams. And what's interesting is that they are disagreeing with you on one point. They said, if we believe Alan the Milk Boy, and he was seen at 6:45, when you add in the walk to the tram station, the first tram station, all the tram operators, when they say they saw him, when he returned back home, they do this special math, and it turns out that William only has 5 minutes to kill his wife and then clean all traces of the blood from himself off. But then we have that jacket, and then you've already said that you can kill somebody in 5 seconds, let alone 5 minutes, is not that big of a thing.
Yeah, I'm not overly concerned about, that space of time at all, especially if let's say he's wearing that bloodstained jacket that is found underneath Julia, then that jacket in essence is a shield. Most people think that when you have these types of homicides that the offender must just be covered in blood. No, they might have a few drops of blood, or there may be some spatter low down on their pants legs if they're bludgeoning somebody whose head is down on the floor. Mm-hmm. But typically, that the offenders walk away from these types of crimes with minimal amount of blood evidence on them. That jacket may have been a perfect shield, and now he's leaving it behind, and because he recognizes it's got blood on it. So that just adds up from my perspective, and I have to rely upon these original investigators for how they, calculated out his movements. Mm-hmm. But if he has 5 or 10 minutes, he could commit this homicide. He could generally get cleaned up, and then he's on the road, and he's already thought of how he's going to establish his alibi. So that would suggest that there's a level of pre-planning. And he's also taking the time to stage the crime scene to make it look like there was some modest financial gain that the offender got, the intruder got. So no, I mean, they found a block of time in which they can't account for. And so it's possible that, the timeline still fits with William being able to commit this crime.
Yeah. And we already were questioning the milk boy, and then you've got to question all of these tram operators, the people who have seen him. If everybody's 1 minute off, that buys him an extra 7 minutes. And, and you've already kind of talked about stage crime scenes never work out for criminals.
Well, they do, but it's oftentimes people don't recognize that they're dealing with a staged crime scene, and that's part of the training I provide to law enforcement.
There you go.
And Dr. Laura Petler is an expert on staging, has written a book on staging. So anybody that is, has interest, they should go and learn about it, because it's real. I think, this timeline where you have the milk boy, you have tram operators, you have William giving certain statements. I think it's all just, it's very loose. I just don't see where you're going to get things down to the minute. It's probably going to be down to 10 minutes or 15 minutes, one way or the other.
Yep. And I think that's what we kind of come down to. There's debate over the locks. The locks on the front and the back are bad on the doors. Could anybody have gotten in there unless you had a key? Was Julia able to? There's so much debate over that it doesn't matter because she could have just opened the door. I mean,
absolutely.
If these were strangers. So that's a little silly to a certain extent. And then, there is Professor McFall who goes, listen, I mean, I can't give you an exact time of death. And there is the other issue. So you're talking about a tight timeline, according to William, that gives him a lot of wiggle room. And the prosecutor doesn't have any other real evidence. And also, Paul, they don't have a motive, which, juries want a motive. There just does not seem to be a big motive here. The defense says William, as I said, doesn't have a motive. He is very proper. I mean, he is a professor. He is not a frenzied person. There's no evidence that he made the phone call. That was the beginning of this ruse. You said that he believed that there were witnesses who said the person who made the phone call to the captain who took the note down for William was not William. I mean, I don't know how you can testify to that, but that's what they say. Sure. And they said because of William's kidney condition, he was basically not able to do all of this, physically able to do all of this stuff. I don't know if that's actually true or not, but that's the defense's theory.
Yeah, but that I don't buy at all. He's a 52-year-old man. He can most certainly swing a fireplace poker or this iron bar. The victim is a 69-year-old woman. And, a motive, it could be as simple as they got into an argument.
Yeah, absolutely.
And he flies off the handle. So, I think as you know, I always go back, to the core of the case, which is the crime scene and what happened to the victim. Mm-hmm. And as I'm hearing about the case, I think I'm stronger than ever thinking that, William killed Julia. And, this isn't a sexually motivated crime. This is not a financially motivated crime. Bludgeoning often is a result of a kind of like an anger retaliatory type of offender. So and William's statements and all that, I'm just not buying it. I right now am kind of really, tunnel visioned on William at this point.
Okay. What do you think the jury's verdict is going to be? Because we're at that point.
It's almost like a coin toss with these types of cases because, with the lack of, good forensic evidence that we would have today, it's the circumstances. You could see where jurors would just acquit, going, there isn't a case here. There's lack of probable cause even for arrest. But then we're also dealing with this time frame, and we're dealing with England and the Liverpool area, and you know better than I in terms of how jurors would be thinking about a case such as this in that region.
Well, if you pretend that none of our forensics really exists today, except perhaps like if you go back to 1931, fingerprinting, there were no fingerprints, it sounds like, for them to compare to. There were no witnesses. There's no murder weapon that they can identify. There's no blood on him. Right. And he has what could be or could not be a good alibi. Then this should be what? A non-guilty or a, should he be acquitted or?
No, I would just say he's a suspect and they haven't developed probable cause for arrest.
Okay.
That's where, I would be. And so, if I were a juror sitting on, and this is all that they're presenting, I'd go, well, yeah, I think there's enough reason to suspect that he's responsible, but I can't vote guilty. And now I think this, here in the United States, the people run the risk of an acquittal, and William could never be retried for murder.
Okay. The jury comes back and they find him guilty.
See, I knew
and he's sentenced to hang.
Oh, good God. Okay. Yeah, it's, I guess I expected that was going to be, where this is going. It's just, as much as I suspect William, I just don't think they have a strong enough case to take his life.
Mm-hmm. Well, it turns out that the Court of Criminal Appeals agrees with you, and they overturned the verdict.
Well, that's good.
And they said the evidence cannot support, a guilty verdict. This is only the third time in the history of the English Court of Criminal Appeal that they've completely overturned a death sentence and a guilty verdict. So here's what's interesting about William moving forward. He tries to go back to his normal life, but he has, people hounding him all the time. He's described in the newspapers and to his face, it sounds like, as a sex maniac, a vampire, a sadist, a mad scientist who preferred human beings to guinea pigs. Oh, it's dramatic. Of course, the customers don't want to have anything to do with him. He gets hate mail. He gets death threats. He ends up, initially taking a clerical job, and then he ends up moving out of Liverpool. And, you kind of, I would think that he would sort of fade off into the darkness. He does not. So in May of 1932, he publishes an article in a magazine called John Bull, and it is titled, "I Know the Murderer." And this is what he says. So it's about a paragraph or so, but listen to what he thinks happened. The murderer, followed my wife into the sitting room, and as she bent down and lit the gas fire, he struck her, possibly with a spanner, which is a wrench. He had now to kill her, to strike her again while she lay on the floor, and him standing over her would mean the upward spurting of blood. 2 strides took him into the lobby where he had observed my Macintosh hanging, and he held it as a shield between him and her body while he belabored her to death. She must have been felled as soon as she lit the fire, and before she could regulate the flow of gas. It would have been at full blaze, and as he bent at the fireplace, the flame set light to the Macintosh. Then he would see that the bottom edge of her skirt was burning, and throwing the Macintosh down, he must have dragged her away from the fire and on to part of the coat, leaving her in the position that I found her.
So I believe what he's saying.
Why would you do that, though? I mean, why would you say all that in a magazine?
Yeah, because, of course, he can claim that he's reconstructing how this crime occurred based on the details he heard at trial or what he was fed during the investigation. But I also believe that he's accounting for a lot of the evidence and how it was found and the reason for it. And I'm going, you know what? I bet there's a lot of truth, but he's just saying somebody else did it. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, he knows the murderer. It's because he's the murderer.
And he says one last thing. This is how he closes out this piece. I know the murderer as readily as I can identify a volume on my shelves. So can I put my hand on the murderer. Only one name have I kept locked in my mind, the name of the man who killed my wife. ... And that is the end of the article.
Yeah, it's that's an interesting thing. How he's, he is being vilified, in very bizarre ways. It's interesting how the public, he's a vampire or he's a sex fiend and all of that. Well, this crime isn't that, right? Mm-hmm. So obviously he's now getting this attention that is really bad. He goes to the point of moving out, and yet he feels compelled to write an article saying, I know who the murderer is. Mm-hmm. And it's almost a tease. This seems like he's getting back at the people who are vilifying him, saying, "Oh, I know who did it." And I'm assuming over there in England, he couldn't have been tried again. Once it was overturned, no. He's basically acquitted, right? Mm-hmm. So in some ways, I'm going to draw a parallel. It's like O.J. Simpson. Very easy for O.J. Simpson, who was acquitted, to now claim, well, I'm going to look for the real killer and continue to be sort of in that spotlight. And everybody, I'm assuming everybody understands, at least my opinion on that is O.J. was absolutely responsible. Mm-hmm. And I think this is what's happening with William. He just can't help himself. So, it's sort of like what we've had with other episodes. It's for me, I don't think the case was strong against William to a point to where you could go and convict him, but I think they went after the right guy.
Well, I want to get to a tiny point that I think fascinates people. So at trial, the prosecutors had said they believed that William took all of his clothes off and wore this Macintosh so that he wouldn't get any blood on himself. Then you've got, I know, because I know you have an opinion about this. And I, when you said something that really made me think about this, the author Joe Nickel thinks that probably he just threw the jacket, the Macintosh, on top of Julia to block the blood. What I heard you say was people don't know about the lack of blood that can happen at a crime scene like this, that maybe he isn't going to be covered with blood at all. And then he gives you this explanation. So what makes sense to you out of all of this?
Well, first, you have to understand that William probably has never killed anybody else in this manner. Mm-hmm. So he doesn't really know exactly what's going to happen. And especially if he's flying off in a fit of rage, where now he's just, striking Julia with a weapon. The Macintosh may simply have been he had killed Julia, and she's laying there. And because this is a behavioral thing that offenders do when they are close to their victims, is they cover their victims up in terms of they don't want to look at what they've done to somebody that they care about. And then the coach catches fire, and now he's having to move Julia, and the Macintosh gets kind of balled up underneath her, and more blood staining is transferred. I mean, it could be something as simple as that. I don't think, I know I talked about him using this Macintosh as a shield, I'm not backing away from that, but I think the Macintosh could have inadvertently, if he had it on, was going to wear it out to go meet up with, whoever, he's just coincidentally had that on, and then he took it off to cover Julia up. But it's very possible that he wasn't wearing anything and got very little blood on himself, and just, the Macintosh was an easy thing to throw over her because it was something that was readily available.
And I'm not sure I would have thought of the naked theory, except that there was a very famous case from 1840 that everyone would have known in England, that everyone would have known about. And it was famous because, well, it was involving, a member of the royal family who was murdered by someone who wore a rain jacket with nothing underneath to prevent the blood. And so that was part of that ruse. So that's the only reason I thought, oh, okay, that's interesting. But you're right. I mean, we can't predict what's going to happen. I actually have to believe it sounds like you think too is sort of a confession that he's written about in a major magazine.
I absolutely believe that.
No. Okay. Well, the ending of this, to me, is some modicum of justice, I suppose. He has kidney disease, and he dies 2 years after he kills his wife. He is buried next to her, which is unfortunate. But so he the theory that I think a lot of people kind of go with is that for some reason he wanted his freedom, or you're right, he got into an argument with her, and then this is how it all happened. But isn't this too much pre-planning for it to be an argument, do you think?
Well, I know when his establishment of this alibi could very well be would possibly indicate that there was some pre-planning element to this. And then why would he kill Julia? Was this where he did want to move on with his life and didn't want her to, I don't know how the divorce process would be out there. Is he trying to maintain, his financial assets that she possibly could benefit from, and that's why he's killing her. But there's also a possibility that, this was all done on the fly, and this whole going out and trying to find, track down this guy, he just took advantage that arrangement was there and purposely got lost and tried to talk to a bunch of people so they all saw him out there. Yep.
Well, that is the end of that story. And boy, what a lot of twists and turns. I think we both suspected William from the beginning, and I think we're right about that. But the lack of forensics and just, everything shows the struggles that people had, investigators had back then, to someone who was so clearly guilty, but they just couldn't prove it.
Right. No, that's, and that's where we have progressed, fortunately, and as technology, gets better, we're seeing where just cases that were made on circumstantial evidence, well, they found innocent people guilty,
yep.
But I think there's enough indication here where William is responsible. They just didn't have enough to prove the case.
Next week, different time period, I promise, and I'm looking forward to it.
All right. As always, Kate, thank you.
Thank you.